The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. Now, as most of you know if you've listened to us for a while, or even if this is your first time joining us, usually Wes and I cover two separate stories in an episode. But this week, as we were looking into what we might want to cover, Wes found this place called Glensheen Mansion, and he started telling me about it, and so I started looking into it too, and we realized that this is one of those places where we really have to dedicate an entire episode to it because there is so much going on at this place, from the history, which is incredible, to the paranormal aspects, to even some kind of offshoots to other things that are connected to this mansion. So tonight's going to be one of those episodes where we both cover the same topic.
Yeah, this place has a little bit of everything.
And a little thing, like, that didn't make sense what I was going to say. I was going to say it has a lot of a little, which, anyway.
You okay?
Yeah.
You sound like me now. Am I rubbing off on you?
Maybe a little bit. I don't know.
That's not a good thing. So that said, sit back, get comfy, and Beth's going to start us off.
All right. So the 39-room, 27,000 square foot red brick mansion on the shore of Lake Superior in Duluth, Minnesota, was built between 1905 and 1908 at a cost of $854,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's a little under $30 million in today's money. So the owners of the Grand Mansion on London Road were quite wealthy. You'd think they would have been surrounded by other equally impressive homes, but the mansion, called Glensheen, sat next to a cemetery. Clara Congdon, the mistress of the house, wrote in her diary, quote, "I will have quiet neighbors." And she definitely did. Turning the wooded 12 acres on Lake Superior into a manageable estate took some effort, and between their architect and landscaper, the Congdons were able to build not just the mansion, but an 8-stall horse stable, a carriage house, an enclosed dairy, a garage, living quarters for their employees, tennis courts, a swimming pool, a boathouse, and a pier. If you visit the massive mansion today, you're in for a unique treat. The entire mansion, which is run by the University of Minnesota, is a true house museum, meaning all of the furniture and personal items inside it are original. The hat on the shelf in the closet belonged to Chester Congdon. The letters in the desk were written by Clara Congdon, and the hundreds of antique pieces were ones they used on a daily basis. You can take different types of tours of Glensheen Mansion, from a garden tour to a full mansion tour. You can learn all about the Congdons, from Chester Congdon's rise in the iron mining business to his many philanthropic causes, to Clara Congdon's unique education to her commendable volunteer work. But what you probably won't hear about on the tour, because it can easily overshadow the amazing Congdon family's accomplishments, are the sinking of the ship named after Chester, the alleged hauntings, and the gruesome 1977 murder. So tonight, Wes and I are going to focus on all of it, both the light and the dark of Glensheen Mansion. To begin, I want to take a minute and describe the mansion a little bit more. As I had said, it has 39 rooms and spans 27,000 square feet. It was built in the first decade of the 1900s, so it has all of the types of rooms that you'd expect: a parlor, a library, a game room, the usual for that time period. Silk wallpaper covers the walls, rich woodwork panels the ceilings, and tiled fireplaces grace 5 of the main rooms. So, who exactly were Chester and Clara Congdon? And why was Clara perfectly content to live next to a cemetery? Let me start from the beginning. Chester Adgate Congdon was born in Rochester, New York in 1853. His family lineage was pretty impressive. His family were some of the first Quaker settlers to arrive in the North American colonies. But when Chester was just 15 in 1868, 3 of his siblings and his father passed away all within the same month, making Chester the head of the family. As a young man, Chester was accepted to Yale, but he decided it was too expensive, so he chose Syracuse University instead. It was while he was there in a math class that he met Clara Bannister. Clara was also attending Syracuse University. In fact, according to the Glensheen Mansion official website, she was one of the first 7 women to graduate from the college. Armed with an art degree, she landed a job teaching art at Alexandria College in Ontario. Then she moved to Pennsylvania, where she taught both art and modern language at Wyoming Seminary. Throughout these years, she kept in touch with Chester Congdon. Chester had been practicing law before moving to Wisconsin and becoming a teacher for a little bit. Next, he moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he practiced law again. Clara and Chester were married in 1881. Together, they had 7 children: Walter, Edward, Marjorie, Helen, John, Elizabeth, and Robert. John passed away at age 2, but their other 6 children lived well into adulthood. The Congdons moved to Duluth, where Chester continued to practice law at the Bilson and Congdon law firm. But law wasn't the only thing that interested him. He bought shares in all kinds of commercial and industrial companies, especially the mining industry. And after he was hired as the general counsel for the Oliver Mining Company and convinced them to align themselves with Andrew Carnegie, he was totally enmeshed in mining companies. And when they consolidated to become U.S. Steel, well, Chester found himself incredibly wealthy at the age of 48. Before long, he was also the vice president of the American National Bank of Duluth. But that's not all. He was also the director of 5 additional companies: the Calumet and Arizona Mining Company in Bisbee, Arizona, the Headley Gold Mining Company in British Columbia, the Green Cananea Copper Company in Mexico, the Marshall Wells Hardware Store, and the Gowan Lenning Brown Wholesale Company in Duluth. As if that wasn't enough, Chester was also the Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota from 1881 to 1886. By 1904, Chester retired from law. I mean, you can see why. He was incredibly busy, and yet he still somehow managed to find the time to have 7 children. Next, he served as a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives from 1909 until 1913. But prior to that, in 1903, Chester decided that he and Clara needed a big house for their rather large family. Speaking of Clara, she was just as busy as her husband. In addition to being a very hands-on mother to her 7 children, she was also actively involved with the First Methodist Church and the Red Cross. But back to their need for a very large house. They chose 14 wooded acres near a cemetery on the shore of Lake Superior and began building their dream home, Glensheen Mansion. As for the significance of being near a cemetery, I don't really think there was any. I think the land they chose just happened to be next to one. But I did get a huge kick out of Clara's journal entry about having very quiet neighbors. Despite the opulence of their home, the Congdons weren't really about flaunting their wealth. They were actually quite the opposite. They grew vegetable gardens in order to be self-sufficient and donated both their time and money to all kinds of causes. Like the time Chester donated money to the state of Minnesota so they could turn a portion of the Lake Superior shoreline into public access land. Their 6 children were taught to value education, to work hard, and to give back to the community. Chester passed away in 1915, while his youngest daughter, Elizabeth, was attending college. Rather than continue her education, Elizabeth came home to help her mother. Elizabeth wasn't really interested in the idea of married life or having a husband, but she did want to be a mother. So in 1932 and then again in 1935, she adopted 2 children. A little girl whom she renamed Marjorie after her older sister, and a second little girl named Jennifer. Elizabeth and her 2 girls lived at Glensheen Mansion with Clara, and for many years the women continued to donate their time and money. According to the Glensheen Mansion official website, Elizabeth was the first president of the Women's Junior League and helped organize Duluth's American Red Cross Nurses Aid Committee during World War II. She volunteered at St. Luke's Hospital and started a women's health clinic with her good friend, Dr. Elizabeth Bagley. And Clara was just as busy, all the way up until her death in 1950. Right before she passed away, Clara received the George Arendt's Pioneer Medal from Syracuse University for her, quote, excellence in humane and cultural pursuits. Elizabeth and her girls continued to live at Glensheen after Clara's death. Now, searching the internet, a person can find all kinds of things about Marjorie Congdon, Elizabeth's adopted daughter. Some of it, I'm sure, is pure speculation, like Marjorie was spoiled, strong-willed, and a handful. Or this one that I find really hard to believe, that she was diagnosed as a sociopath at age 10 in 1942. Or that she despised her Uncle Robert because he kept telling her mother to practice tough love and to stop giving in to Marjorie's demands. All of this could be nothing more than vague half-truths, embellishments, and even false information. You can't believe everything you read, especially on the internet. There are at least 2 books out there on Marjorie Congdon, which I have to believe are well-researched and accurate. But I wasn't able to find any excerpts online that really told me anything about who Marjorie is as a person. All I can really do is stick to the facts of what happened in 1977. But even then, I have to back up a little bit to 1968. As Elizabeth got older, she worried that Glensheen would be too much for her family to take care of. And so, in 1968, she made a plan to sell the mansion to Duluth University, according to hauntedhouses.com, with the understanding that they would turn her home into a museum. Then, Elizabeth suffered a stroke and was wheelchair-bound and unable to communicate. But with the help of home care nurses, she was able to eat by herself and to write letters. She received excellent round-the-clock care at the mansion, especially from a nurse named Velma Pytila, who was close to Elizabeth's age. However, due to Elizabeth being incapacitated in a lot of ways, all of her money was placed in a trust. At this point, her daughter, Marjorie, had been divorced and married a second time, and she had 7 of her own children. She was living in Colorado with her second husband, Roger Caldwell, but things were not going well for them at all financially. Marjorie had already completely wiped out her own trust fund, and the trustees in charge of her mother's money cut her off. Their house was in foreclosure, and their vehicles had been repossessed. When Elizabeth died, Marjorie was due to inherit $8 million. She signed papers saying that Roger, her husband, was entitled to $2.5 million of that. And then she paid a visit to her mother, bringing her a gift of homemade marmalade. The marmalade was apparently laced with sedatives, and when the house staff figured it out, they kicked Marjorie out and told her not to come back. On June 27, 1977, Nurse Velma Pytila, who had retired at this point, agreed to cover a shift at Glensheen when Elizabeth's usual nurse needed the time off. Velma missed Elizabeth and was more than happy to do it. That night, after the daytime employees had left, it was just Velma and Elizabeth at the mansion. At some point, an intruder broke into the mansion through a back door and bludgeoned Velma with a candlestick, hitting her 23 times. They left her body propped up in a window seat on the central staircase. Then they made their way to Elizabeth's room, where they smothered her with a satin pillow. Although it was unclear what they were looking for, the intruder was looking for something, because they completely ransacked Elizabeth's bedroom. The following morning, the daytime employees discovered both Velma and Elizabeth, and when police arrived, they helped them determine that a jewelry box and some rare coins were missing from Elizabeth's room. Police initially assumed that it was a robbery gone wrong, but when they discovered Velma's car at an airport parking lot, they turned their attention immediately on Roger Caldwell, which we'll get into after this quick break. Hey, did you know? In the 1820s, President John Quincy Adams approved an expedition to send 100 men to the center of the Earth. American Army officer John Cleve Sims Jr. believed that both the North and South Poles had access to Earth's hollow core, where he was pretty certain a race of people lived inside the hollow earth. His plan was to meet them and set up valuable trade with them. President Adams thought this sounded like a great idea and gave the go-ahead. Unfortunately, his term as president ended before the expedition was underway. New President Andrew Jackson got a good laugh at the proposed expedition and put a stop to it. Who'da thunk it?
All right, we're back. And just before the break, Beth had mentioned that the police had turned their attention on Elizabeth Congdon's son-in-law, Roger Caldwell. He was arrested and stood trial. Marjorie didn't attend any of Roger's trial. In fact, she denied knowing anything about his plan. But police weren't so convinced, and when they had gathered enough evidence, Marjorie was arrested as well. During her trial, Marjorie was a darling of the press, according to the Artful Living magazine article, My Weekend with Marjorie Congdon by Alyssa Ford. She regaled the press with stories about her life at Glensheen and spoke badly about the police. Suddenly, she was rushing to Roger's defense, even going so far as to say they pulled hair out of Roger's armpits for evidence. She complained about how the jail wouldn't let him have a pair of Hanes underwear that she had written, "I love you" in. Then she'd go off on the Glensheen trustees for leaving her on the brink of homelessness. But she also tried to cultivate a picture of innocence by bringing her lawyer a chocolate cake on his birthday and even talking to the prosecutor about donating to her horse sanctuary. She even knitted in court. Roger was convicted in 1978 and sentenced to 20 years. Marjorie was found innocent. While he was in prison, Marjorie married for a third time, even though she was still legally married to Roger. Her new husband was recently widowed. Her children filed a civil suit against her, arguing that she was involved in the murder, and had her yearly trust allowance lowered to just $40,000. After serving 5 years, Roger's case was retried, based on new evidence, and he agreed to a plea deal. If he confessed to the murders, they'd let him go on time served. He took the deal and was released. 5 years later, in 1988, he took his own life. His suicide note said that he had not murdered his mother-in-law or her nurse. However, later DNA testing showed Roger was a 99% match. Meanwhile, Marjorie was arrested for arson, for burning down her own house. She served 2 years in prison, and then her third husband, Wally Hagen, died under mysterious circumstances in 1992. The autopsy showed strong sedatives in his system, and Marjorie found herself arrested again. And again, she was acquitted. She claimed that she and Wally had made a suicide pact. He had gone first, but when her turn came, she had chickened out. Then Marjorie was arrested for arson a second time, this time for burning down her neighbor's house. She was sentenced to 15 years and served 12 of them. Just 3 months after her release, she was arrested for a fifth time, this time for forgery, identity theft, fraud, and computer tampering. She was released in 2009. As far as we know, Marjorie is still living. She's in her late 80s or early 90s. Glensheen Mansion did indeed end up going to the University of Minnesota, just like Elizabeth wanted, and has been a museum since 1979. Although, from the very beginning, docents were instructed not to talk about the murders at all. Instead, they were to focus on the accomplishments of the Congdon family, and rightfully so. With such a long history of donating to charitable causes, giving back to their community, and promoting education, it's only right that the museum focuses on those things. But they were also asked not to talk about the ghost either. In fact, paranormal investigators at the property are not allowed. Recently, they did a nighttime flashlight tour, but it was only for a limited time. And yet, the stories of apparitions and strange happenings have still made it into magazines, online articles, and the occasional most haunted lists. Reddit is full of posts, back and forth between people, debating the hauntedness of Glensheen. Some say that it's all hooey, while others claim that not only did they experience it, but they have video to prove it. So, what exactly are people experiencing? Well, according to MinnesotaMonthly.com, both employees and visitors believe Velma and Elizabeth still walk the halls and visit the main staircase where Velma lost her life. There are reports of unexplained flashes of light on the stairs that don't seem to be caused by reflected sunlight or the headlights of passing cars. Visitors have snapped photos of the empty stairs and captured dark, shadowy figures. And other visitors have commented on the unnatural cold air hovering in one particular spot at the first floor landing. But Velma and Elizabeth don't just hover around the stairs. They're actually seen and felt all over the mansion. According to HauntedHouses.com, the most common report is a figure standing in various windows looking out through the panes of glass, even when the mansion is empty. Most often, these figures are said to be looking out of Elizabeth's former bedroom. Lights have been known to turn on by themselves in empty rooms, or even after the employees have locked up for the day and gone home. Both the library and the living room are hot spots. A white mist has reportedly formed more than once in front of the library shelves, and shadowy figures move throughout the living room quite frequently. But everyone seems to agree that Velma and Elizabeth, if that's who the spirits are not threatening or scary in any way. It's almost as if they enjoy having visitors to the house. At the very least, they seem to be going about their business without really interfering with the living. Well, except for the items that they like to move around. Remember, the mansion is filled with many personal items that once belonged to the Congdon family. One site I looked at said that after the murder of Elizabeth, the remaining Congdon family couldn't bring themselves to go into the house and sort through all of the personal effects. And so they just left it all there for the university to display as museum pieces. So whether that's true or not, well, it's hard to say. But it is true that the museum is filled with personal items. So it's quite possible that both Velma and Elizabeth are just going about their own daily routines and picking up items and putting them back down wherever they want to. Or maybe they're wondering why a museum employee has moved some of their things and they are simply trying to put it back where they feel it belongs. But other than that, Velma and Elizabeth are described as both warm and welcoming, and not something to be afraid of. And the shadow figure that is reported to stay in the basement isn't scary either. Apparently, the basement spirit feels more male, and the speculation is that he may be the spirit of a handyman who has never left the property. Regardless of the unnerving sensation of seeing a shadow figure or finding items you put down in one place showing up in another, employees and visitors say that Glensheen Mansion actually has a happy and light feeling to it, that it kind of exudes a happiness that the Congdon family felt there for many, many years. So like I said before, focusing on the murders isn't something the museum really wants to do. Their vision statement, according to their website, is to be the best historic house museum in the upper Midwest by engaging our community through our dedication to education inspiration, preservation, and innovation, which they do by offering not just tours, but lectures, concerts on the pier, and private events like weddings and parties. And this is the point that we usually end an episode after we've shared the history and the hauntings of a place. But in this case, we came across something else tied to the Congdon family that has a story all on its own: a ship. The SS Salt Lake City was built in 1907 by the Chicago Shipbuilding Company. She was a steel-hulled American lake freighter designed to carry grain between the U.S. and Canada. The time between her construction and her maiden voyage was so fast that she actually set a record. She was 552 feet long and 56 feet wide, with 32 telescoping hatch covers that were each 9 feet wide, which allowed access into her 10,200-ton capacity hold. She was powered by 2 coal-fired boilers that were almost 15 feet in diameter each. In 1911, she was sold to the Acme Transit Company, and then a year later to the Continental Steamship Company, when she was renamed the Chester A. Congdon. Chester Congdon, the man, was still alive, and probably pretty honored that a ship had been named after him. But the SS Chester A. Congdon, as far as freight ships go, was plagued by accidents. The first was in April of 1912, as she was being pulled by tugboats in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Somehow, the lines broke, and the Chester A. Congdon hit another freighter traveling down Lake Michigan, named the Charles Weston, damaging the Weston's hull. In August of that same year, while also on Lake Michigan, the SS Chester A. Congdon drifted into a shoal during some heavy fog. 90 of her hull plates and 50 of her frames were damaged so badly that she basically limped into Superior, Wisconsin, and needed 10 full days of repairs. Then in September of 1913, she struck the breakwater in Fairport Harbor, Ohio, damaging her steering quadrant. It seemed like the Chester A. Congdon was either suffering from inexperienced crew or very bad luck, or perhaps even a curse. And even after all of that, things didn't get very much better. In October of 1915, she scraped bottom in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, while traveling the Detroit River. Several rivets were sheared off, and her hull sprung several leaks. She was repaired once again. For the next 3 solid years, she made voyage after voyage, carrying cargo after cargo with no problems. Maybe the bad luck had worn off, or maybe she wasn't cursed after all. On November 5, 1918, she arrived in Fort William, Ontario, where she was loaded up with 380,000 bushels of wheat. She then headed out for Port McNicoll, Ontario. Soon after passing Thunder Bay, she sailed right into a storm. Her captain was Charles J. Utterson, and he decided to turn around and head back to Thunder Bay and anchor there until the storm died down. And it did, but a massive fog rolled in. Afraid of being too far behind schedule, Captain Utterson set her speed at 9 knots, or 10 miles an hour, and headed for Passage Island. He'd sail for 2.5 hours, and if the fog still hadn't lifted, he'd drop anchor again and wait it out. But unfortunately, he didn't get that chance, because at about 1 p.m., the ship ran aground on the southern end of Canoe Rocks, at the northeast point of Isle Royale. The first mate immediately got into a lifeboat and sailed for the Passage Island Lighthouse, about 7 miles away, where he hoped that the lighthouse keeper could help them. Meanwhile, a fishing boat arrived to help and took the second mate to Fort William. But their boat broke down on the way there, and they didn't arrive until 6 a.m. the next morning. The Canadian Wrecking and Towing Company set out their wrecking barge the Empire, and 2 tugboats right away. They thought that if they removed most of the cargo, that they could stop the Congdon from taking on any more water. 3 tanks were already full, and perhaps they could save her. On November 8, after only being able to remove 50 to 60,000 bushels of wheat, a second storm blew in, battering the already sinking ship, until she broke in half. On November 29th, businessman James Playfair of Midland, Ontario, purchased the wreck for $10,000, about $135,000 in today's money, with the promise of raising it. But by December, the Chester A. Congdon had disappeared beneath the surface. She was Lake Superior's first ever $1 million shipwreck. In today's money, that's almost $5 million. She was the largest shipwreck in Lake Superior until the 1975 sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. To this day, she rests mostly intact in 2 separate pieces in 60 to 220 feet of water. And she's a popular spot for divers to explore, where they're mostly intact pilot house, forecastle deck, living quarters, stern cabins, windlass room, and engine room. But how ironic is it that a ship named after Chester A. Congdon, out of respect for the man, would have suffered such a fate? The Congdon family was one of those families that just seemed to find happiness and fulfillment in helping others. Yes, they were incredibly wealthy, but they earned that privilege, and for the most part, seemed to take it on as their responsibility or duty to give back to the community. Their story is so much more than one awful event that really should have never happened. It's really about the accumulation of years of hard work, years of family love, and years of caring for their community. And when people tell the story of the Congdons, they should really tell all of it.
I agree with you. And that's why it was important to me and to you, I think, that we did tell the whole story, that we didn't just focus on the murder, and that we focused on everything that they accomplished.
Well, you know how people are. They like to focus on the bad.
Right.
And you know what I love about this museum is that it contains all of their personal items, as they once used them.
And left them.
Yes.
I mean, if it's true that the reason everything is there is because the family didn't want to go back in and take everything, it truly is exactly how they left it.
It's a time capsule.
It's a total time capsule.
You know, I see these videos online of where people explore abandoned places, and they go in and it looks like the people just upped and left.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this reminded me of.
Yes, absolutely.
But this just has, it's just beautiful on the inside. Their items were just exquisite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they had the best of everything.
Yeah. It's not like leaving some Dinty Moore in the cupboard or some lima beans or something.
Right.
I mean, they left behind cool stuff, and everybody gets to enjoy it and see it.
And up close and personal, where there's no ropes in this museum that you have to stand behind.
Right.
You can literally go up to everything. It's really cool.
That's the way it should be.
Mm-hmm. Well, everybody, if you would like to know more about the Congdon family, this is one of those cases where there really is hours of reading you could do. The Glensheen Mansion website is really, really interesting, and there are pages about all the different women of the Congdon family, not just Clara and Elizabeth and Marjorie. And I highly recommend delving in a little bit for yourself and learning more about them.
Join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to traveling with you again to the places where our minds wander.
If you like what you heard, please take a moment and provide us with a 5-star rating and a comment on your favorite listening platform. It really helps us move up the list and become more visible on the podcast charts so new people can find us.
And thank you all for your continued support.
See you next week for an all-new episode.